Welcome, everybody. We're going to give just a few more seconds to let some people come in, and then we'll get started. But we're going to give people a few more minutes or a few more seconds, and then we'll get started. So watch people trickle in here for a moment. All right, should we go ahead and get started, I think? All right, well, welcome to our DPLA's Genealogy Webinar. We're going to go over some really interesting case studies with Allison here at the end. This webinar was put together by the DPLA Outreach and Assessment Working Group. There's a link here to the working groups. Not everybody from our group is speaking today, but everybody was involved in all of our meetings and has worked to put this together. So many thanks to all of our members of our working group for that. And this is an outline. And before I go through the outline of what we're going to do today, I just want to say, obviously, this is being recorded and the recordings will go out through the social media channels later. So if you want to come back to this, you'll be able to. We're going to ask that you hold all your questions to the end, but go ahead and put them in the chat if you want. We have somebody monitoring the chat, and that way, you don't forget your question if you do it that way, and it's in the chat, and we'll get to it. I think that's all the housekeeping we need. So I am the digital archives librarian at Florida International University, and I'm just going to get us started here, and then I'm going to hand it off. Sarah Zimmerman, who is the librarian archivist at the Chicago Public Library in charge of the Chicago Theater Collection, will be our first panelist, and she'll tell you a little bit about the types of resources you can find that would be helpful for genealogy and DPLA. She will hand that off to Ann Hanlon, who is the head of digital initiatives at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and she'll give you some really helpful information on how to search DPLA. So some things to look out for. So definitely pay attention to that. And then we will get to Allison Ryall, who is the genealogy specialist at the Orange County Public Library here in Florida. And she is going to show you some really great case studies of different types of documents you might not have thought would relate genealogically. So we're looking forward to that. And finally, Virginia Dressler will be managing from Kent State University, sorry, I should give her a proper introduction. She's the digital projects librarian at Kent State University, and she will be managing our chat for us and taking your questions. So that is it for me. So I'm going to hand it off to Sarah.
Hi there, everyone. So DPLA, I don't know how many of you are familiar with that or not. So I just want to share a little bit about what is DPLA's mission. What is our goal? Digital Public Library of America empowers people to learn, grow, and contribute to a diverse and better functioning society by maximizing access to our shared history, culture, and knowledge. That's a big goal, and DPLA is a big resource. Next slide, please. How big? Over 44,400,000 some odd and growing resources from the digital world. That's documents, photographs, various text, videos, sound, and it's from across the United States. DPLA functions as kind of a single access point, this cultural gateway into the riches held by our libraries, archives, and museums. And it is a first step. That's something that Ann will talk about a little bit more, in that this gives you a taste. You may have to go into the digital collections then of those libraries, archives, and museums to see a full object. But what an amazing first place this is with 44 million plus items. It's open to all. It's a national digital library. So it's for all of us. It's not a registered database that you can log in from anywhere. And it amplifies then the value of our libraries and cultural organizations. It's a big, huge, wonderful marketing device, as well as that gateway to cultural and intellectual riches. Next slide, please. So what makes up those 44 million items? A lot of it is research guides will help you to kind of determine, okay, where do I start? 44 million is a lot. How do I narrow it down? DPLA has done some of that for you by setting up some kind of big topic areas, education, which includes things like primary source sets, teaching guides for, think of a great American event, Great Migration, World War II, online exhibitions, and also online ebooks, which can be a great resource. Family research, which is what I'm suspecting here for today. Collection highlights that you could use for those: family photographs, yearbooks, local maps, family Bibles, correspondence, military records, oral histories, on and on and on. We also cater to those who are interested in lifelong learning. You don't have to be a student or a genealogist to log into DPLA. And also scholarly research. We have access to various journals, various primary resources, obviously, that will help our scholars too. Next resource, please. Or slide, thank you. Speaking of resources, we reached out to our hubs. So we reached out to our places that upload metadata from across the country to say, hey, what do your researchers think of when they think of genealogy? What do you send them to? Some of the obvious ones kind of came up: naturalization records, church records, but also things like sanatorium records, newspapers, magazines, marriage records. And what you'll learn, and what Allison will talk about, is that sometimes you need more than a name, especially if you've got a tricky name like Sarah. There are a lot of Sarahs out there. And so to look at how can you build on your research and maybe look at a neighborhood, at an area. Where did this relative come from? What other pieces of the puzzle can you put together? And so go ahead, next slide. For those of you who have used DPLA or others, go ahead and put in the chat, what are some of your favorite resources for genealogy research? And we'll take a couple seconds for that, and we can share some of those out at the end. So I see census coming up, local newspapers, town reports, great. So, Ellis Island website. Oh my gosh, you guys have so many ideas. This is just like awesome. I love seeing this chat waterfall. So we're going to have a lot to come back to. But for now, I do want to pass it off to Anne, because Anne's going to give us some of the nuts and bolts of, well, okay, we've got these 44 million records. How are we going to get in there? How does it work? Anne, it's all you.
All right. All right. Thanks, Sarah. And thanks to everyone for your contributions. These are fantastic resources. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how DPLA works, what it means to search in DPLA. Because as Sarah said, and we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Yeah. As Sarah said, there are millions of items in DPLA. We've got different numbers, in fact, because I recorded my number probably on my slide after Sarah did. She did her slides earlier than me, right? So over, nearly maybe 45 million by today items so far. So there's an abundance of materials in DPLA and a variety of materials in DPLA. Photographs, documents, oral histories, a lot of the kinds of items that folks are entering into the chat are the kinds of things that you can find in DPLA. And the way that DPLA acquires all of these materials is that it's actually not technically acquiring anything. It's an aggregator. And what that means is that hundreds of thousands of institutions across the United States contribute their records to DPLA. And DPLA then makes it possible for you to search across the records from multiple institutions. And that's really the strength of DPLA. But that abundance and that variety also means that you need to have a strategy to search in DPLA. And can we go to the next slide? So how do you find that needle in the haystack? So you can start truly just by, first of all, going to DPLA's site, which for those of you who have your browser open, you can just type in dp.la into your browser bar. And you can just enter a search. I did my last name, Hanlon, just to get started. And as Allison will talk about later, that's not necessarily the best search strategy for genealogical research, but just for the purpose of sort of diving into DPLA, it's a fun way to get started, just to see what's there. And so in my case, the search returned a number of records, not more than I could handle, but for some of you it might. The nice thing is that on the left side, you'll see that there's a way to refine your search. And here you can do things by, first of all, checking what the rights are. If you want materials that you can reuse in a publication, for example, maybe you want something with unlimited reuse. Perhaps you're just looking for images. And so you can see that you can search for just the kind of generalized type, but you can also limit by year. You can limit by location. If you happen to know an archival or museum or historical collection that it's part of, you can open that tab up and see which collections the materials maybe that you're seeing are coming from. And so those are just some ways to refine your search and just to learn more about what you're searching in DPLA. Can we go to the next slide? So an important thing to know too about what you're searching in DPLA is that you're searching what's called the metadata of the item. So the material that us librarians and archivists have entered into the catalog about the item, as opposed to searching the full text of the item itself. And that's an important distinction in terms of searching. So things like the title that we've often supplied, the date, if we know the date, you can see in this example that there isn't a date supplied. The type of item, again, whether it's an image, also the format, so things like photograph, and the description, if a description is supplied. And that's where you might have the opportunity to search more kind of natural language type of search. DPLA does have a really useful search tips page, which goes into a little more depth about using things like Boolean searching, so and or type searches, and using quotation marks to pull together phrases, for example. But one, I mentioned earlier that DPLA is an aggregator. And so when you are searching and you find an item, so for example, in this case, I found a photograph of Russ Hanlon holding a child in France. And you can see, if you go to the next slide, thanks. So, well, just this view full item. So when you click on that in DPLA, what that will do is that will take you out, and we can go to the next slide. That will take you out to the site where the item itself is held. So the repository where that item is held. So in this case, this is at a historical collection in Knox County Public Library, and it takes me to their collection site. And so that means that at this point, if this is what I'm interested, there's often additional metadata at the host site. So a little bit more descriptive information that may be found in DPLA, as well as more information about accessing and using the item. You also usually have the opportunity, depending on the host site, to zoom in on things like photographs and documents, possibly even to download them, depending on rights, and again, the policies at the host site, as well as access to the collection that that item is a part of to learn more about the context of that particular item. So we can go to the next slide. And DPLA, helpfully, also has a family research guide on the site, we have the URL here at the bottom if you'd like to look there for a few more tips specifically on how to use DPLA for family research. DPLA has a number of search guides on the site, but given the context of today's webinar, I thought this would be the most useful one to highlight. And so that's just a really, really quick overview of what it means to search in DPLA and some quick sort of basic search strategies. But I'm going to turn it over to Allison now to provide some really in-depth information about some use cases for genealogical research and some really specific tips on ways that you can get a lot out of DPLA. So thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Got it.
Hopefully, are you seeing my screen? We
I
good?
am.
All right,
Outta here.
wonderful. So, DPLA for genealogy really is unlimited with the potentials. I think what we have to do as the end users is be creative in how we get the information out of the site. As we mentioned earlier, simply sitting down and putting a name in is not always going to be an effective search, as it wouldn't be on any other site. That's not exactly how Ancestry or Family History Library's website, Family Search, that's not how we get maximizing our results out of those. So you have to think creatively, yes, names, but also locations. Where were people living? What does DPLA have maybe for that city, that town, that region of the country? Maybe specific topics, perhaps immigration, perhaps occupations, things like that, a very specific topic. Is there a collection that is centered around a specific time period or a specific function that you may be able to dive into and find additional information? Also, partners, the people who were contributing, sometimes it's worth exploring which libraries, institutions are contributing to DPLA because they may have something in the area where your ancestors were living. And collections, things are grouped together into collections. So you have to really think creatively about how to get the information out of there on what you are looking for. So I've come up with 10 very short but unique examples of information that I found in DPLA for a variety of genealogy cases or situations that I had been working on. So one of the things that I really love about DPLA is that it has a lot of wonderful resources for African-American research. If you've ever done African-American research, you know that this can be challenging, especially as we approach a wall, what we call it, the wall of slavery. Very hard to move beyond that. And they have some unique resources that can assist with that. So one of the examples we have here, this is the 1870 census. So like I said, African-American research is always challenging as we approach the wall of slavery. Ellen McLeod here is found in the 1870 US federal census. She's living with her husband and 3 children, Caroline, Thomas, and I believe Jane is a baby at this time. But not too much was known about her life prior to this 1870 census. However, with creative searching and connections, the DPLA website was able to help a lot. Through a search, we're able to discover a bill of sale for Ellen from one slave owner to another when she was enslaved. And there's also an indenture agreement after the Emancipation Proclamation where she is referred to as a freed woman, and it addresses her daughter Carolyn as well. So this is what one of the original documents looked like. It is in the collection. It consists of a bill of sale from Savannah, Georgia, for the purchase of an enslaved woman, Ellen, and her child, Caroline, and an agreement that was made between Ellen and Agnes McQueen. The bill of sale shows that Jackson Hodges paid $3,700 to Samuel Hauser. And the bill of sale also notes that Ellen has a burn, so we learn a little bit about her health and her physical description. A year later, after the end of the Civil War, we find an indenture agreement that was made between Angus McQueen of Montgomery County, Georgia, and the quote, now freed woman Ellen. In the agreement, Ellen agrees to continue working on McQueen's plantation. McQueen promises and agrees to feed, clothe, and give medical attention to Ellen and her child. These terms are considered to be Ellen's just compensation for the labor performed, and McQueen agrees to these terms as long as Ellen will obey all orders and will be respectful and submissive and obedient. So this is a copy of the indenture agreement between them. You can see it's a little bit challenging to read, but it is very legible, especially if you enlarge it on your screen. And it was signed by Agnes McQueen, and Ellen, who was illiterate, she was not able to read, so she made her mark in agreeing into this indentured service agreement with her former slave owner, Agnes McQueen. So we learned a little bit about her and a little bit about her child. We also learned through this who her 2 previous slave owners were, which if we continued our research would hopefully help us establish Ellen's lineage back beyond that wall of slavery. Example number 2, we have surviving family members of an African-American veteran. So we have some information on Emmett Jackson. He was an African-American military veteran who served in the Army as an engineer during World War II. He was in the Army from around January of 1944 to May of 1946. We were able to find some genealogy documents for him. We have an obituary, we have a death certificate, we have a headstone application, and they're all providing bits and pieces of information, but nothing's really given us a full picture of all of his relatives or his survivors. Note that he did die, I believe it was in Indiana, I believe is where the death certificate is from. But his funeral program is available online on the Digital Public Library of America on DPLA. It has his full obituary as part of the funeral program for him. We learn his birth date, his death date, his funeral date, the church that handled it. This collection is part of the Atlanta Funeral Programs collection through the Digital Library in Georgia, and some other organizations are involved as well. But what's really interesting, even though it's in this Atlanta Funeral Programs collection, he died in Indiana. So don't allow place and location to limit you. In other words, don't shut this out just because it's Atlanta when you know he died in Indiana, because his funeral program is available there. We can see who's wrote the obituary, who's doing the singing at his service, when he died, everything about it, including the obituary, which says Mr. Emmett Jackson was born on May 8th, 1917 in Fort Mitchell, Alabama, to Mr. and Mrs. Frank Jackson Sr. So we know about Emmett. We now learned about his parents. We know when he moved to Indianapolis, Indiana, 1938. He joined the First Samuel Baptist Church in the year of 1965. He remained there until his death. He passed this life November 20th at his home. We learn all of his survivors. He leaves to mourn his mother, Mrs. Fanny Jackson of Phoenix City, Alabama. So we now know where she lives. 3 sisters, Mrs. Fanny M. James, Mrs. Susie Anna Daniels of Phoenix City, Alabama, Mrs. Annie Lee Williams of Indianapolis, 2 brothers, Mr. Frank Jackson Jr. and Mr. Tommy Jackson, also of Indianapolis, and 2 aunts, 1 uncle, and a host of relatives and friends. Wonderful information on his life was found in a place you probably wouldn't have thought to look for it. So be creative. Never know what you might find. Third example, I love this one. This is a diary of an African-American midwife. Mrs. Beatrice Borders, she was born 1892, died in 1971. She was the founder of the Georgia B. Williams Nursing Home, located on the corner of Beacon and Dyer Streets in Camilla, Georgia. She was a 3rd-generation midwife. Mrs. Bia, as she was called, began her service as a midwife in the community of Mitchell County as early as 1918 with help from her mother. And there is a shelter that is now created in her tribute, this Georgia B. Williams Nursing Home, and it is on the list of endangered historical places. The women that she worked with went into the homes of mothers to be delivering babies at a time when segregation was still part of our society. And in most cases, the living conditions of the expecting mothers posed health problems to them, their infants, and even the midwives. So she really overcame and did a lot during her life to fight for women's health and women's rights in delivering children. All of her diaries, Mrs. Bia's delivery diaries, are available through the Digital Public Library of America. So not only are we seeing and learning about Miss Bia, we're learning about all of the women that she delivered children of and about the children themselves. Each one of her entries includes the name of the mother, the time the baby was delivered, the weight of the baby, and where, in some cases, where the baby was born. Like she may note specific towns, like if she went into a woman's house, things along that line. This is what we're looking at on the screen is book F. So this is 1965 deliveries. If you ever know genealogy, getting birth records from 1965 for family members is very difficult. We have this information here in these diaries. So this is an amazing resource for anyone doing African-American research in the area where Beatrice Borders would have been delivering these children. Wonderful, wonderful, creative resource to get modern time birth records. Example number 4, of course, there's all types of genealogical documentation, stories, forms, what you would think of as a standard genealogical resource. We have things like pedigree charts, Bible records, family history, and lineage papers. The one that is on the screen right now is coming out of a pedigree chart, coming out of the folder of notes and correspondence regarding the genealogy of the Quarterman, Baker, Mallard, and Schaefer families. This folder includes a lot of trees. There's a lot of correspondence back and forth to and from Sally Baker, who lived between 1862 and 1953. So any of the typical genealogical documents you can think of, you may be able to find resources and copies of things on there, especially older families, older pedigree charts such as this. There's also written books as people made notes about their family. Sally was researching the Baker family in particular, and this is a lot of writings on all of the Bakers who had come to America, their children, when they immigrated, perhaps a little bit about their life in Great Britain, etc. So there can be papers and documentation about family history and family lineage. Family Bible records. This is another wonderful source. There are samples in various collections from all around the United States. They're not limited to just one area. The one you're seeing on your screen is the Ferguson Family Bible record from North Carolina. This spans pages from 1843 all up to 1969. The one that you're looking at is mostly in the mid 1800s. This one in particular is a copy. It's not the original Bible scan of it. You can see it's noted at the top. It's taken from a photostat copy of the Ferguson Family Bible, but sometimes you can actually find the original written pages like this. This is from a family Bible owned by the Bledsoe family in Indiana. And this is, copies or digital images of the actual family Bible pages on them. In the 1850s, 1860s. This is wonderful. A lot of states did not keep vital records until well into the late 1800s or early 1900s. New England's a little bit of an exception, but most of the other states started a lot later. And these family Bible records can be an invaluable resource in order to be able to document birth dates, death dates, and marriages, especially for those who are applying maybe for lineage societies. If you've ever tried to get into any lineage society, you have to document your generations. You've got to show that connection of parent to child, and you often need births, deaths, and marriage dates. And these family Bible records sometimes are the only place where that exists, especially when they predate any recording of vital records in states. Here's another one from Tennessee, Jefferson County. This is the Bible record of the Chadwick family. This is back from early 1801, 1804, 1823, etc. And again, we're getting to see the original handwriting in the original pages of this. Other types of typical genealogical documents we might find, there's Revolutionary War pension and bounty land warrant applications. This one is coming from the Bureau of Pensions for Prince Vaughan. This was filed on the 21st of April, 1818. And it tells us about his service in the war. This is coming from New York Mayor's Court, and he's awarded a pension, his pension application. The other thing I noticed on DPLA is the richness of family oral history interviews, especially for immigrants. And this is wonderful because even if the immigrant isn't your specific family member, if they're coming from a town or a village or a location to a place here in the US that parallels perhaps what happened with your family, it's an interesting context in order to be able to compare, or a context in which you can place your family. And I found some really wonderful, unique ones. One that I found was Zainita Lipitskaya. Lipitsky would be her name here in the US, but Russian women had a feminine ending, so Lipitskaya was how she's documented in some of the obituaries and her death index in Minnesota that I was able to find. This helps us really learn about people's lives in what we call the old country, their journey to this country, how they persevered, how they overcame, and what successes and challenges that they faced. Zainita Lipitskaya was born in St. Petersburg, Russia in 1921. She was born during the Russian Civil War, and she immigrated to Missouri, and she spent her life working in the healthcare industry. So a lot of her immigrant interview, we have both a transcript available on DPLA, and we also have the actual audio recording. And when she's speaking in Russian. And then there's a translator who translates it, so you can, hear what she's saying. But it's really wonderful, the context that she gives us as to what it was like living there during the Civil War with the Bolsheviks and what she was enduring or experiencing. That's a firsthand account of that time period. And she puts in such a rich context. If we don't want to take the time to listen, there are PDFs and transcripts of it. And she's also a Jewish immigrant. So we've got a lot going on and a lot of richness that she can add to both lives of Russian immigrants, Jewish immigrants, etc., people who may have lived in Russia during the Civil War. Another wonderful example we have is Hispanic interviews. We have Tomas Perez. He was born on the 21st December, 1933 in Mexico. He just died last year, September 2020, just a little over a year ago in Salt Lake City, Utah. And in 1984, he was interviewed about his childhood in Mexico and life in America. And we don't have the recording for him available, but there is a transcript. And there's a whole series of Hispanic oral histories that's part of this collection. He talks about his parents, his childhood in Mexico, picking cotton in California, his move to Salt Lake City, his working for the Union Pacific Railroad, how he got a job working for John M. Wallace, his involvement with the Mexican Civic Center. It's 83 pages long. So for someone who has a similar background, perhaps working on the railroads, some family members who worked in the Union Pacific Railroad, or family members who came from Mexico, he can help put their life into context at that time period. Example number 6, there's a lot of unique items on there, things that you really wouldn't even, first think of. One of the things I found was there's pageant and mask of St. Louis registration cards. The one that's on your screen is for Mrs. Clinton Parrish Headley. They give her maiden name. She was Emily Yomes, born 1914. But because this is kind of a membership society, this pageant and mask of St. Louis, it tells us a little bit. We learn who her mother and her father are, but she talks about interesting incidents in her family history. And she says, my grandfather, John J. Miller, was of the pioneer settlers of St. Louis, came to St. Louis via the Erie Canal, then by stagecoach, working mills along the road. And she goes on from there. So we have her family being put into context as well. And this can help descendants of her ancestors, as well as other peoples whose families may be paralleling a similar story. Example number 7, naturalization documents. If you've ever tried to look for naturalization documents, you know what a challenge it can be. Prior to 1906, naturalizations pretty much took place in any court of record in the United States. They can be found on a local, a state, or a federal level. You can even find them in criminal courts or marine courts. After 1906, most naturalizations were processed in the federal courts, although occasionally some local courts continued well beyond the 1906 date. Prior to 1906 as well, we have a wide variety of forms used in naturalization. The amount of information you'll find will vary from court to court, year to year. And then on 20th of September, 1906, the Basic Naturalization Act was passed, and the naturalization process was turned over to the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization, which is now USCIS. And from that point on, the forms became more uniform. But there's a lot of naturalization documents on here, both pre-1906 and post-1906. And the ones that I love on DPLA are the post-1906 that are not in the federal court, because the federal court records are a little bit easier to find, but the people who didn't go through the district courts, it becomes very challenging to find their naturalization documents. So here's an early one. This is a petition for naturalization for Samuel Slater. This is from the district court in Rhode Island, even though it was early it was obviously prior to 1906. Samuel Slater sought U.S. citizenship after residing and creating businesses for himself in the United States for more than 16 years. He was often referred to as the father of the American Industrial Revolution because he helped to design the first textile mills in America after he migrated from Britain in 1789. So here is his petition for naturalization. This is coming from Rhode Island, from the district court in Rhode Island. And then after 1906, we have this one as well. There is a collection that has naturalization records of non-federal courts in Connecticut. Of course, it covers the earlier period, but all the way up to 1975. It's really helpful when we can find these records, when most people were going to the federal courts in 1906, after that, and being able to find those that are in non-federal courts and having access to them through DPLA can really be a windfall for someone that is looking for them. Example number 8 is house histories. I've helped a lot of people do research on their homes, either the homes that they're currently living in, excuse me, or the homes that perhaps their ancestors built. And there are several different locations, Pittsburgh being one of them, who have volumes of building permits. So when anyone was either building or making alterations to their homes, they had to apply for inspections or they had to apply for permits. And we can find these in these older books that are the building permits. So it tells us who the owner of the home is, who the builder, excuse me, of the home is, and gives us other information. Is it a dwelling? Is it a building? You can see one of these is an orphanage house. The other is a school building, and it gives us the general address, usually the intersection or the street that the house is on. So we can know when the buildings are being built, who the owner was at the time, and what, alterations perhaps that were being done. What was the value and what was the size of the home at the time? So this is really wonderful. On my dad's side of the family, my German immigrants built a lot of the buildings that are in what is today Scranton, Pennsylvania. And being able to find books like this is really helpful, knowing what they built, how they built it, when they built it, and what alterations were made. Example number 9 is historical photographs of locations. So this is a photograph of my great-grandparents. This is Konstantin Lipitsky on the left and his wife, Melania. Konstantin immigrated to the United States in 1913 and his wife, Melania, joined him in 1915. Being Russian immigrants, coming from what is today part of Belarus, they have posed or have been I don't want to say brick wall, but they have been my difficult research. Trying to go back beyond them or find out much about them has always been a challenge. And Konstantin came in first. He was working here as a laborer. And when he sent for Melania in 1915, this is her arriving on her passenger manifest. We have Melania Lipitsky was their last name, Lipitskaya. You can see that it's written here. And it tells us, who she left behind in Russia. And on the second page, it tells us where she's going to. And she's going to her husband, Kostik, which is a nickname for Konstantin Lipitsky, 3313 Mulberry Street, Pittsburgh, PA. Well, I grew up in the Pittsburgh area, and I can tell you, Mulberry Street is in what is called the Strip District. It's a very industrial part of Pittsburgh, and I could never really figure out where did they live, in there. It's a very long street, or Mulberry Way, Mulberry Street, Mulberry Alley. It has different endings on it. In the Strip District. And I was able in DPLA to find pictures. The one on the left-hand side, it's a view of Mulberry Alley. I believe the address is pretty darn close to that 3313 that was listed on the passenger manifest. And this was taken in 1914, the year after Melania would have arrived. So this is what that area looked like when they were living in it. The upper picture on the upper right is Mulberry Way, 1919. It's a little bit later, but you can see that they were digging up and replacing a lot of the bricks that are showing in the alley or the Mulberry Way in the left-hand picture. So this is just something that is really helpful to put that story or that context of my family, together. And last, example number 10, businesses that are no longer there. So I grew up in this really small town called Russellton, Pennsylvania. Russellton really is a blip on a map. It is a very small town. It's located northeast of Pittsburgh. In 2019, recently, the population was less than 1,400 people. It was originally a mining town. That's what it was built for coal mining. That whole area out there was quite a bit of mining. There's Russellton, there's an adjoining town called Curtisville, Carmerville, all of this. And Russellton, despite being small, was actually 2 towns at one point. There was Russellton #1 and Russellton #2. And it was because they were named after the mines. The town was actually built around the mine. So #1 meant you worked at the one mine. Russellton #2 meant that you worked at the other mine. I was shocked. DPLA, I did a search of Russellton. Usually when I put Russellton into a database, it comes back and tells me no results found because nobody's ever heard of it. It's such a small place. And in there, they have pictures of the coal mines, which my ancestors and distant ancestors worked in. These buildings are no longer there. The mines are closed. These pictures were taken in about 1917, and this is the Republic Collieries mine in Russellton, Pennsylvania. I vaguely remember seeing the one building or buildings like this when I was a very small child, so, you know, long time ago. But this is a wonderful picture to have because I know my ancestors and other people who have been married into my family walked in and out of these buildings many times, and the buildings are no longer standing. So in telling the story of our family history, this is a wonderful picture to be able to include in that information. So that's what I had for you. You can see the very creative, unique ways of approaching genealogy while using DPLA. And I thank you for listening and for allowing me to share my stories with you.
Thank you so much, Allison. That was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Allison.
Thank you.
And
oh, go ahead.
yeah, no, I was gonna say, I'm gonna let Virginia ask some questions and the appropriate panelist can answer it.
Sure.
You know what, we might want to ask the question about, are these slides going out? And I don't know the answer to that. So maybe Kat can answer that.
Hi, I sure can. Yes, we can make the slides available on the DPLA events page, and I think eventually we'll put them in on the genealogy page as well. But I'll post a link in the chat where you can look for both the recording and the slides, probably later today or tomorrow. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
All right, well, I will start in on the Q&As, and please feel free to continue to put in these great questions. I will try and merge. There was a few from the chat that I think overlapped the Q&A. So the first one is, how is this information that is available on this site different from what is available on Ancestry or Family Search?
This is Allison. I'll try to answer that. From my experience, there are some things that are duplicated. You'll see there are census records that are also on Ancestry and Family Search, but this goes above and beyond. All of the examples I gave, a lot of them are not on Family Search or Ancestry. The midwife diaries are not there. Indenture agreement is not on there. A lot of the photographs aren't there. So, you know, one of the things I learned about genealogy, it's about how you approach the question. You know, you have to get really, you know, researchers have to move beyond searching on a name. You have to look for, you know, for context, for location, for places, for occupations. And that's how you can find some of this creative stuff. So yes, there are some duplicated information, but there's also a lot that is unique that you can find through you know, the DPLA site that you're not going to find on Ancestry or Family Search.
Great. The next one I have, which might be for one of the DPLA folks, any consideration of a feed or harvest of finding aids from archival repositories like Archives West?
Who wants to take that one?
I'll take that one.
Okay.
This is Shanae, Director of Community Engagement for DPLA. We have discussed previously incorporating finding aids and collaborating with larger projects like the National Finding Aid Network to make some of those available. A grant was received for the NAFAN project, and we are currently collaborating with the California Digital Library, of which that project is coming out of, and there could potentially be some overlap. So that's something that we're exploring. Great question.
Thank you. Next question, has any Canadian information been given to DPLA?
I'll take that one as well. Yes, we have a number of contributing institutions that have shared maps, artifacts, and a host of other kinds of materials representing Canadian history. Some of those contributors are Cornell University, our National Archives, the University of Washington, and archive.org, but it's actually let me make sure I have the right name right, Canadiana.org, which is through archive.org. On a simple search, there are over 385,000 results for Canadian materials.
All right, thank you. I'm going to try and combine two questions together. Someone in the chat had said, can anyone or entity enter information into DPLA or only libraries? Someone gave an example of they had a self-published booklet of their father's family genealogy. How could they submit that to DPLA?
Materials are contributed to DPLA through our hubs network. Oftentimes when we receive questions from researchers and family members who have materials, we connect them with local libraries in their states to facilitate a relationship, to talk about the materials and set up a process for digitization so that they might ultimately be shared and accessible through DPLA. The partnership goes through the local libraries.
Great, thank you. There's a question from Chris Clemmer. He says, please show how these documents were found. Chris, I didn't know if you had a specific one or if you'd want to kind of add to that question. I'm assuming that's for Allison.
I can answer generically. I mean, I can't demonstrate each one. It's just about searching in different ways. So if you're looking for the example, the Hispanic immigrant interviews, don't search on a name, search on, Hispanic interviews, Hispanic immigrants, Mexican immigrants, on the topic or the subject. I always explain to people for any searching that you're doing online, you kind of want to approach it like you would if it was an old-fashioned library card catalog where you had to flip through the cards. Usually in those cards, if you're trying to find something in an overarching volume, you normally would not go in and search under a person's name. You would find the topic or the subject or location. You might find, look and see what they might have for Scranton, Pennsylvania, and then start looking for specific people. So that's kind of how I approached all of the searches on here. It wasn't about putting in a name. It was just being creative in what I was looking. And of course, for the presentation, I was trying to show diversity as well, diversity for various ethnicities and races and time periods.
There's a comment and question that says, excellent content, thank you. I see that presenters are good researchers and likely librarians. Are any of the presenters certified genealogists?
So I am not a librarian. I am a full-blown genealogist. It's the only thing I do. I teach for Boston University and their certificate for genealogical research program. I work for the Orange County Library System as their genealogy specialist. Mostly what I do is work with a lot of law enforcement agencies on cold cases and murders and homicides and other types of cases like that. I am not a certified genealogist by choice. I don't want to be because there are some conflicts with being a certified genealogist and doing the law enforcement work that I do.
One person is asking, how is copyright handled?
I suppose any of us panelists might be able to answer that to some extent, right? Each of the libraries makes decisions about what is either in the public domain or what we have permission to make available in our own repositories and then contribute to DPLA. And then DPLA also makes a rights statement available and requires it for all of the items that are in DPLA. So if you recall, in the section on searching DPLA, you have the ability to refine your search based on the rights status of that item. So whether or not it's in copyright, whether it's in the public domain. And so hopefully that helps to answer the question. I don't know if anyone else would like to add to that.
That's good, Anne. Thanks. One person saying, I'm having trouble finding my oops, I just lost it on the Zoom chat. 1 sec. I'm having trouble finding where my great-grandfather naturalized, as he lived in a number of places, Illinois, Minnesota, Iowa. Do I check court records in each town in the time frame he lived there? He came from Denmark and covered his tracks running away circa 1868 from something. So information is very vague. Thanks. I'm thinking that's an Allison question.
Yeah, that one's a little bit challenging. If he would have came in after 1906, the passenger manifests have coded numbers on it, and you can figure out which court he naturalized in if it was post 1906. But if he was naturalized pre-1906, which it's sounding like maybe he was, then there's no easy secret way to finding that. So you would have to figure out at what time point you think he became naturalized, and then you're going to have to look at the closest courts to him in that time period. Just know those early naturalization records that are going to be in the town courts are not going to be as rich in information regarding genealogical materials as you would find in the post 1906 documentation.
Great, thank you. There's another question. When searching, are all items searched accessible at the item level, or are there some that are only searched at the collection level?
Can you repeat the question, Virginia?
Yeah, sure. When searching, are all items searched accessible at the item level, or are there some that are only searched at the collection level? And I think they're normally the item level, correct?
I think it all often depends on the institution and the way that they've described those materials. Some materials may be at the folder level, for example, but I think it's probably easiest to think about the materials in DPLA as being at the item level.
Trying to clump some of these together. How does our Genealogy Society contribute to DPLA? Shanae, I think we might have covered that already, but.
I actually reached out to her and gave her an email address to get in touch with us.
Great.
Thank you.
Here's another good specific one. How would you search for a church in a town which was last known about in 1880, Mustcash in Erie County, Ohio? I'll be looking for some search tips.
Repeat the question. I'm not following what was being asked.
How would you search for a church in a town that was last known about in 1880? The town name was Mustcash, M-U-S-T-C-H-S-H, in Erie County, Ohio.
Was the church last known about in 1880, or is the town last known about in 1880?
It's a little unclear from the question.
Yeah,
sorry.
the answers would be different.
Okay. That was from Kathleen, if she wants to try to clarify.
I can give two quick answers, I guess. If you're looking for a church and the church is no longer there, I actually just did a webinar on church and cemetery records earlier today. You try to see if the church records have been given to an archive, if they're in a historical society. Try to find the next closest church that's the same denomination and talk to them to see if they know where the records are from the church that's no longer in existence. Sometimes the records just don't exist. Check Family Search. Sometimes they've digitized them. If it's the town that's no longer there, then try to figure out using old gazetteers exactly where that town was and what it's called today. There should be, city directories, gazetteers, things like that should be able to help you figure that out. So if something is completely wiped off the map, it might be renamed. I just came across another example where a town was wiped off the map in New York because they filled it in with water and it became a reservoir. So it's no longer listed because it's now a bunch of water. So stuff like that, but there's usually records of that, especially looking in old gazetteers and things like that.
Let's see, I've got a couple more in the Q&A. I have contacted the Union Pacific Railroad in Kansas City for the records, but they say that they have none from the mid 1800s. Would DPLA have some?
I can't speak to DPLA. I didn't search their sites for this. This is Allison speaking, but I can tell you that there's not a lot of records for railroads, period, in the mid 1800s. They just don't have them. It's well into the 1900s when we start seeing really good records. The records that are going to be around from the earlier 1800s are going to be administrative, meaning people who were running the railroads or held like engineer positions. But if you're looking for average common laborers who help build the railroads or workers, most of those records simply do not exist from the mid 1800s.
All right, there's another, this is kind of a different sort of question, probably for the DPLA folks. I've sort of been following the DPLA Wikimedia relationship. Will all DPLA content feed Wikimedia or just images?
This is, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Okay. No, I was just going to ask if Shanae was there, but Anne, if you can take that, that'd be great. Otherwise, I can promote Michael.
I can answer what I know about the Wikimedia relationship, which is, and this is Anne, the institutions that are contributing to Wikimedia via DPLA, the kinds of material that we can contribute have to be either in the public domain or free of copyright. So that's really the primary criteria for contributing, as opposed to whether it's an image or not, but oftentimes images are preferred. But Michael, I think, would probably be able to give a much more detailed answer.
We've got another good question about the search in DPLA. Is there a search feature that you can filter to isolate new resource or records?
Well, you can filter, this is Anne again, you can filter based on date, but that's the date of the item as opposed to when the item was contributed to DPLA. So if I understand the distinction that the person is making in this question, I don't think, well, and someone from DPLA can correct me on this, but as far as I know, there's no way to limit so that you can see items that have been newly contributed. So for example, if you're coming back after a couple of weeks and you want to see if something's there that wasn't there before, I think that might be what you're getting at. But you can limit based on the date of the item itself. In other words, the date the item was created.
I think we've got most of the questions. If I see any others, and I apologize, I'm trying to flip between the chat and the Q&A. So there's a lot of overlap, but if I see any ones that are outstanding, I will try to do my best to get back to you with answers. I wanted to thank everyone who presented today, especially Allison. I think that was fantastic. I'll do my virtual clapping and just thank you for your time. Anyone that wants to, add in any more questions can do that now. And Kelly, do you want to say any other parting words?
I am just so glad everybody joined us. I think I learned a lot about the different types of resources that might have genealogical material. So this has been great. And thank you to all of our presenters who were from our working group that were willing to do this.
Thank you all.